Evelyn moved briskly through the silent corridors of Blake Mansion, dusting the mahogany shelves and aligning the books with meticulous precision. Her life here was a series of orderly routines, an unbroken rhythm that rarely deviated. But tonight, something in the air felt different. Richard Blake, the elusive CEO who occupied the uppermost floor of the mansion like an emperor in his tower, had summoned her to his office. Richard sat at his desk, his piercing blue eyes scanning a mountain of papers, barely acknowledging her presence as she entered. His silence was almost an art form, a tool he wielded to unsettle those around him. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up, his gaze cold and calculating. "I need you to accompany me to an important dinner tonight." His voice was curt, devoid of pleasantries. "This is not an invitation, it's an instruction." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she was more surprised or irritated. Her face remained neutral, but inside, a storm brewed. She was used to his brusque manner, but this was different. Dinner? With him? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the request, or rather the command. This wasn't a date, clearly. But why her, of all people? "Understood, sir?" she replied calmly, masking her intrigue. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her unease. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She finished her duties with an almost mechanical efficiency, all the while wondering what this dinner could possibly entail. Was he trying to intimidate her? Was she just an accessory to make him appear more grounded, more human? She shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. Whatever the reason, tonight she would find out. At precisely 7, Evelyn descended the mansion's grand staircase, her simple, elegant black dress flowing around her. She didn't know where Richard had sent for the dress, but it fit her perfectly. Its understated elegance, a stark contrast to the gaudy opulence she imagined in his circles. Richard waited for her by the front door, his impatience evident in the way he tapped his watch, not bothering to look up as she approached. "Let's go," he muttered, as if she were nothing more than a briefcase or a set of keys. For a moment, Evelyn felt a flicker of resentment. But she pushed it down, her face a mask of composure. They arrived at an upscale restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering cityscape. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the murmur of low, practiced laughter. As they approached the table, Evelyn could feel the eyes of Richard's business associates on her. The men in tailored suits exchanged glances, their polite smiles concealing barely veiled curiosity. Richard offered no introduction beyond a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is Evelyn," he said simply, as though she were no more than a placeholder. Evelyn took her seat beside him, determined to maintain her poise. The investors, men with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, launched into a discussion of stocks, markets, and expansion strategies, the conversation laced with ambition and subtle threats. Evelyn sat silently, her eyes scanning the table, taking in the power plays and the shifting alliances. The conversation paused, and then one of the investors, a tall man named Mr. Lewis with a piercing gaze, turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Evelyn, how does it feel to be in such elevated company tonight?" A slight hush fell over the table, the question laced with a condescension that set Evelyn's nerves alight. She could feel Richard's gaze on her, daring her to step out of line. But something within her stirred, a need to prove herself, to stand her ground. "It's fascinating," she said smoothly, a calm confidence coating her words. "The numbers are certainly impressive, but I imagine the people behind those numbers are just as crucial to the company's success. After all, there's a difference between a company and a community." Her words landed like a stone in a quiet pond, sending ripples across the table. Mr. Lewis looked at her with a flicker of surprise, a glint of respect mingling with his earlier condescension. Richard, on the other hand, looked as though he'd swallowed a lemon. She had defied him, spoken out when he had made it clear he wanted her to remain silent. As the dinner continued, Evelyn noticed Mr. Lewis and a few others stealing glances at her, intrigued by her presence and her unexpected poise. Richard's silence grew colder, more brittle, each glance directed at her, seeming to chip away at his carefully constructed control. By the end of the night, Evelyn felt a strange surge of triumph. She had not just survived the evening, she had left her mark. And when she caught Richard's eye, the look he gave her was anything but indifferent. The soft light from the restaurant's chandeliers cast a warm glow across the room as Evelyn returned to her seat, her face calm but her mind ablaze. The sensation of having pushed a boundary, of having stepped beyond the role Richard had silently assigned her, pulsed within her. She had challenged him in the smallest way, yet she felt the tremor ripple through the evening. Richard, however, looked far from pleased. His jaw was set, his expression hardened as he turned back to the conversation with the investors. Evelyn could feel the tension radiating from him, as if her mere presence was an irritant. Yet, a part of her relished it. Throughout the dinner, the investors continued discussing profits, projections, and the endless machinations of power, but Evelyn could sense the curiosity in the room shifting. Mr. Lewis, a man with a confident gaze and a reputation as one of the industry's shrewdest players, took every opportunity to engage her in conversation, asking questions that subtly probed at her intellect and ideas. "So, Evelyn," Mr. Lewis began with a smirk, "what would you suggest to a company aiming to improve its image?" Evelyn hesitated, aware of Richard's intense gaze on her, but something in her refused to shrink back. "I believe image isn't just crafted through PR or marketing. It's the result of actions that align with the values you claim to uphold. If you want loyalty, start by fostering it among your employees and the community. Integrity can't be faked for long." A silence fell, deeper this time, heavier. One of the younger investors shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Richard as if waiting for his reaction. Richard's face was a mask of stoic indifference, but his eyes burned with thinly veiled ire. Still, he said nothing, letting her words hang in the air like a dare. At last, Mr. Lewis let out a low chuckle. "Richard, it seems you've brought someone with a fresh perspective." He lifted his glass in a small toast to Evelyn, as the others followed, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. Evelyn accepted the toast, keeping her expression poised, though her heart was hammering in her chest. Richard leaned in, his voice a low, cold murmur only she could hear. "You're here to be seen, not heard. Don't forget that." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a fire she didn't attempt to hide. "With all due respect, sir, you may have underestimated me." Richard straightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her, cut her down with a few well-chosen words. But instead, he smiled, a glacial, calculated expression, and turned his attention back to Mr. Lewis. The evening continued, but Evelyn's presence had shifted the balance at the table. The investors now looked to her for insights, seeming to appreciate her fresh, unvarnished honesty. Richard, though visibly annoyed, seemed almost fascinated. She could feel his resting on her every so often, as if he were recalculating, reassessing this woman he thought he knew. Toward the end of the dinner, Mr. Lewis leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, Evelyn, I'd almost say you're wasted as a housekeeper," he said with a twinkle in his eye, sending a flicker of amusement across the table. Richard's mouth twitched, but he remained silent, and Evelyn's confidence grew. The thrill of speaking her mind, of being recognized beyond her position, was intoxicating. She cast a glance at Richard, whose expression remained unreadable. Yet she could feel the simmering storm beneath his calm exterior. When the evening drew to a close, Richard barely gave her a chance to bid farewell to the investors. He escorted her swiftly to the car, his hand firm on her elbow, guiding her with a surprising urgency. The driver closed the door behind them, and silence filled the confined space as they sat in the dim light of the car's interior. Richard was the first to speak, his tone low and charged. "What do you think you were doing back there?" Evelyn kept her gaze forward, her voice even. "You asked me to accompany you, not to be invisible." A taut silence filled the car. Evelyn could feel his anger, his frustration, but also something else, something darker, lurking beneath his carefully controlled facade. Finally he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't know the game you're playing, Evelyn." She turned to him, her face calm but her eyes defiant. "Maybe not, but I'm not afraid of it." Their gazes held, the air thick with an unspoken tension. In that moment, she saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of something raw, unguarded, before he masked it again. The rest of the drive was steeped in silence, but Evelyn felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. She knew she had left an indelible mark on Richard's world, and she had a feeling he wouldn't soon forget it. Back at the mansion, Evelyn entered the grand hall with her head held high, feeling the echoes of the evening still buzzing in her veins. The moment she stepped over the threshold, she sensed Richard's presence close behind her, a storm brewing just out of sight. He wasted no time before calling her into his office. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her in the tension-filled room with him. Richard stood by the window, silhouetted against the darkness outside. He didn't turn to face her, instead choosing to speak to the city lights stretching out before him. "I don't know what you thought you were doing back there," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "but I did not bring you to that dinner to be a spectacle." Evelyn bristled at his words. "A spectacle?" She took a step forward, her pulse racing. "I simply spoke my mind. Isn't that what you business types do all the time?" He turned then, slowly, his gaze icy and piercing. "Your job is to stay quiet, Evelyn. Your role." "My role?" She interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "I've been working here for 3 years, Mr. Blake, and I think I've earned the right to be something more than just part of the decor." The silence between them thickened, the air practically vibrating with the tension. She could see the conflict in his eyes, a flicker of something he was struggling to suppress. Evelyn held her ground, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to back down. For once, she had forced him to see her, really see her. He crossed the room in a few swift steps, stopping mere inches from her, his gaze never wavering. "You think you understand my world? You don't," he murmured, his tone a blend of frustration and something darker, something that sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn raised her chin, her own frustration matching his. "Maybe I don't, but I'm not afraid of it, and I'm certainly not afraid of you." A charged silence enveloped them, the tension like an electric current between them. Evelyn could see his chest rise and fall as he struggled to keep his composure. She sensed she was treading a dangerous line, but she didn't care. She had crossed a threshold tonight. She was no longer willing to be dismissed. At last, Richard turned away, dragging a hand through his hair, his restraint visibly unraveling. "You have no idea what you're risking, Evelyn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking to himself more than to her. "Then tell me," she challenged, stepping closer. "What am I risking?" He looked at her, his expression raw, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. But instead of answering, he let out a humorless chuckle and shook his head. "You're not the type to back down, are you?" "No," she replied firmly. "Not anymore." For a moment, something unreadable passed over his face. He seemed almost impressed, almost intrigued. But then his mask slipped back into place, his features hardening as he straightened. "Then you leave me no choice," he said coldly. "From now on, you're off the clock. You no longer work here." Evelyn's heart dropped, but she refused to let it show. She stood there, staring him down, refusing to let him see any sign of weakness. "Fine," she said with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "If that's what you want, Mr. Blake." She turned and walked out of the office without a backward glance, leaving him standing alone in the dimly lit room. She could feel his gaze on her as she walked away, a gaze heavy with unresolved emotions she could barely understand. As she reached the doorway, he called after her, his voice low and conflicted. "Evelyn." She stopped, waiting, half hoping he would say something, anything to break the silence between them. But there was only the faint sound of his breathing in the heavy stillness, and she knew he wouldn't take back his words. So, without another word, she left, her steps echoing through the empty hallways. That night, she packed her things, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, exhilaration, and an odd sense of triumph. She had lost her job, but she had won something much more valuable, her freedom. And as she closed the door behind her, Evelyn knew she was leaving more than just the mansion. She was leaving behind the timid, voiceless woman she had once been. In the weeks following Evelyn's abrupt departure from Blake Mansion, whispers of her defiance and her departure rippled through Richard's circle. At first, he had brushed off any questions, dismissing them with a wave of his hand and a forced indifference. Yet, deep down, Evelyn's absence gnawed at him in ways he could neither explain nor ignore. One late evening, as he sat alone in his expansive office, staring blankly at his city view windows, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. The silence was unbearable. He poured himself a drink, the sharp scent of whiskey filling the room, but the alcohol did little to dull the gnawing sense of loss. Evelyn's presence, the fire in her eyes, her quiet strength. He hadn't realized how much he relied on those things until they were gone. A knock on his office door jolted him from his thoughts. "Mr. Blake," his assistant said, holding out a slim envelope. "From the board of Covington Enterprises, they requested a meeting." Richard's brow furrowed. Covington Enterprises was one of the few companies he hadn't yet conquered, a formidable force in the market. Taking the letter, he quickly skimmed it, his eyes narrowing. The invitation wasn't to negotiate a deal, but rather to attend a high-profile investor meeting. And then he saw it, a name at the bottom of the list of attendees, Evelyn Sinclair. The air left his lungs. She was with Covington now? The realization burned. It wasn't just that she had left. She had stepped into a world he considered his own territory, rising above the ranks to command her own respect and authority. He clenched the letter in his hand, a fresh surge of anger and, if he were honest with himself, something dangerously close to admiration coursing through him. 2 days later, Richard entered the opulent boardroom of Covington Enterprises, exuding his usual aura of confidence. But beneath his polished exterior, his nerves bristled. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for her almost involuntarily, until he saw her, Evelyn, seated at the far end of the table, her head held high, radiating a quiet, fierce elegance. She wore a deep burgundy suit that complemented her composed demeanor, and her hair was swept back, revealing her strong features and steady gaze. The other executives surrounded her, listening intently as she spoke, her words resonating with a weight he had never seen her wield so openly before. She was no longer the quiet housekeeper who blended into the background. She was a force to be reckoned with, and every person in the room felt it. When she finished speaking, a hush fell over the boardroom, followed by a murmur of approval. Evelyn glanced up, and her eyes met Richard's. The moment felt electric, a collision of past and present, filled with unresolved tension. She held his gaze, not a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, as if daring him to challenge her. The meeting continued, but Richard found it nearly impossible to focus. Every word she spoke was measured and precise, each one a reminder of the woman she had become, a woman he could no longer control, and worse, a woman whose respect he now inexplicably craved. At the end of the meeting, Evelyn gathered her notes, preparing to leave. Richard couldn't resist any longer. He crossed the room, his movements swift and determined, intercepting her just before she reached the door. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low but charged, "you've certainly come a long way." She paused, her expression unreadable as she regarded him. "Thank you, Mr. Blake. I suppose necessity breeds resilience." He clenched his jaw, every word she spoke striking him like a challenge. "It didn't take long for you to land on your feet. Or perhaps you were waiting for an opportunity to get close to someone like Covington." She tilted her head, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Perhaps you underestimate me. I didn't need anyone to hand me an opportunity. I earned this." There it was again, that quiet defiance that both infuriated and fascinated him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He had expected her to disappear into obscurity after their last encounter, but here she was, more formidable than ever. As the silence stretched between them, he found himself wanting to apologize, to somehow bridge the rift he had created. But pride held him back. "I won't underestimate you again, Evelyn," he finally said, his voice softer, almost admitting defeat. "But be careful. This world can be ruthless." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I know exactly what this world is, Richard, and I'm not afraid of it anymore." With that, she turned and left the boardroom, leaving him standing there, hollowed out by the emptiness of her absence. Richard realized, as he watched her go, that he had lost far more than just an employee. Evelyn had slipped through his fingers, and with her, any sense of control he had once possessed over his carefully curated life. He returned to his mansion that evening, the house feeling colder and emptier than ever. The once comforting silence now felt suffocating, as if it mocked him. Evelyn had broken free from his world, and he was left alone, surrounded by his own hollow achievements. For the first time, he questioned whether his power and wealth had any value at all if they meant losing her in the process. The days that followed were marked by a sense of restlessness that Richard could neither ignore nor quell. Every night, he found himself replaying the encounter in Covington's boardroom, haunted by the image of Evelyn's calm defiance. She had become a powerful player in the corporate world, a world he had once dominated without question. But now, for the first time, he felt uncertain, as though the very ground beneath him was shifting. One morning, a notice arrived. Covington Enterprises had acquired a significant portion of Blake Enterprises' shares. The revelation struck him like a blow. He knew Covington's aggressive acquisition style. They were known for swooping in on struggling companies and taking over by sheer force. And now, Evelyn was at the helm of those decisions. She held sway over the company he had built from the ground up. The irony was bitter, and the knowledge that Evelyn was partly responsible for his vulnerability left him simmering. The two companies held a joint leadership meeting, and Richard felt the weight of anticipation pressing on him as he entered the room. Evelyn was already there, seated confidently at the head of the table, her gaze calm and impassive as she reviewed her notes. The other executives were there too, whispering amongst themselves, glancing between Richard and Evelyn with thinly veiled curiosity. The tension was palpable. As Richard took his seat, Evelyn acknowledged him with a polite nod, nothing more. He noted how she was in complete control, how every word she spoke during the meeting commanded attention. But his pride wouldn't allow him to sit quietly and observe. Midway through the discussion, he couldn't resist, cutting in with a suggestion that bordered on criticism, questioning one of her proposed strategies. Evelyn's eyes lifted to meet his, her gaze sharp as a blade. She paused for a beat, letting the silence linger, her expression composed yet carrying a subtle challenge. "Thank you, Mr. Blake," she replied smoothly, "but we've thoroughly assessed the potential risks. It's a measured decision based on market projections." Her calm response felt like a rebuke. Richard's fists clenched beneath the table, a knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He was used to controlling the room, yet here he was, nearly invisible, as Evelyn skillfully maneuvered the conversation back into her control. As the meeting ended, Evelyn gathered her notes, her actions unhurried, entirely unaffected by his presence. Richard watched her, feeling a surge of something he couldn't quite define. Admiration tinged with resentment, desire threaded with frustration. Unable to restrain himself any longer, he stepped forward as the others filed out, cornering her by the conference table. "Impressive performance, Evelyn," he said, the sarcasm barely concealed. "You certainly know how to handle a room." She looked up at him, her eyes steely. "This isn't about performing, Richard. It's about making decisions that impact people's lives, something you may have overlooked." His jaw clenched. "I built this company from the ground up. Don't assume you understand everything it takes to lead." Evelyn held his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe I don't know everything, but I know enough to recognize when leadership is tainted by ego." The words hit him hard. She saw through him with an unnerving clarity, stripping away the facade he had perfected over the years. For a moment, he was speechless, caught in her piercing gaze, feeling the weight of every decision he had made in his career bearing down on him. And in that silence, he knew she was right. After a tense moment, she spoke again, her voice softer but no less resolute. "People deserve a leader who listens, who values them beyond their productivity. Maybe that's something you should think about." Without waiting for a response, she turned to leave, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked away. The emptiness in her absence was suffocating. Richard stood alone in the silent conference room, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: regret. But fate had a twisted sense of humor. Not a week later, a board meeting was called to review Richard's leadership and his commitment to the company's new direction. Evelyn was present, her composure unshakable, her gaze unwavering as the board questioned him. Every point raised was a subtle but pointed reminder of his failures, his lack of transparency, his dismissal of employee concerns, his single-minded pursuit of profit over purpose. When he glanced at Evelyn, he saw something unexpected, a trace of disappointment, as if she had once hoped he might rise above his pride. That look stung more than any criticism the board could throw at him. Finally, when it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she addressed the room with measured words, but her eyes remained fixed on Richard. "The company's future lies not in expanding its market share at any cost, but in building trust and creating lasting value," she said, her voice steady. We must ask ourselves if our leadership reflects those values. It was a direct challenge, one Richard could no longer brush aside. The board's eyes shifted to him, awaiting his response. For once, the sharp words he had always relied on failed him. He was stripped bare, his pride dismantled by the very person he had once dismissed. In that moment, Richard understood that he stood at a crossroads. He could cling to his failing pride, or he could embrace the uncomfortable truth that Evelyn's words revealed. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to speak, his voice low but steady. "You're right," he said, looking directly at Evelyn. "I've been blind to the things that matter. I'm willing to change, but I can't do it alone." A murmur swept through the boardroom, and for a fleeting second, Richard saw a flicker of surprise in Evelyn's eyes. She held his gaze, assessing him, as if deciding whether he was worth the effort of redemption. Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Then prove it, Richard, not with words, but with actions." And with that, she left the room, leaving him to grapple with the weight of his own transformation. The weeks that followed felt like a rebirth for Richard, though a painfully slow one. Every instinct he had built over his career, to control, to dominate, to be feared, was gradually unraveled by Evelyn's influence. Her voice lingered in his thoughts, challenging him, compelling him to reassess every decision he made. He threw himself into the company's new social initiatives, attending meetings he would have previously deemed unimportant, listening to employees who once only knew him by reputation. But the true test came on a rainy afternoon when Evelyn invited him to join her on a visit to one of the community centers their company had recently funded. At first, Richard was reluctant, his pride prickling at the thought of spending a day in what he once saw as mere charity work. Yet something in Evelyn's calm gaze silenced his protests, and he agreed. When they arrived, the center was bustling with life. Single mothers balancing jobs and parenting, young people learning skills to build careers, families struggling to make ends meet. Evelyn moved through the crowd with an ease that left Richard both humbled and fascinated. She greeted people by name, listened to their stories, and spoke to them as equals. Richard watched, feeling almost like an outsider, yet something stirred within him as he witnessed the genuine respect Evelyn had earned. As they entered one of the community rooms, a young woman named Julia approached Evelyn, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a second chance. I never thought I'd have the skills to support my son, but now I can finally see a future for us." Evelyn smiled, touching Julia's arm gently. "You did the hard work, Julia. We just opened the door." Richard felt a pang in his chest, a mix of admiration and guilt. He had once dismissed such initiatives as distractions, but here he was, seeing the impact firsthand. These weren't just numbers or names on a report. They were lives transformed, futures reclaimed. His gaze shifted to Evelyn, who was watching him with a subtle, knowing smile, as if daring him to feel what he had always resisted. At the end of the visit, Evelyn suggested they take a walk through the nearby park. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and fresh, the scent of wet earth hanging in the air. As they walked, Richard felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, as if he were finally seeing the world through new eyes. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low, "I owe you an apology." She glanced at him, her expression soft but guarded. "You don't owe me anything, Richard. This journey, it's yours." He stopped, turning to face her, the weight of his emotions finally breaking through. "No, I do. I was blind. I thought power meant control, that success was measured by how much I could take. But you've shown me a different way." He paused, searching her face. "You've shown me what it means to truly lead." Evelyn's eyes softened, and for a moment he thought he saw a glimmer of emotion beneath her calm exterior. But she merely nodded, as if accepting his words while keeping her own emotions at bay. Over the following months, Richard worked tirelessly to prove he was sincere. He poured his energy into the community projects, joining Evelyn on every visit, listening to the people he once ignored, and gradually earning their trust. He learned that leadership wasn't about wielding power. It was about empowering others. Slowly, his presence at the community centers became less about impressing Evelyn and more about a genuine desire to make a difference. He felt the shift within himself, the steady unraveling of his former self, and for the first time, he was truly at peace. One evening, after a long day at the community center, Richard invited Evelyn to dinner. She hesitated, her gaze searching his, but eventually agreed. They dined at a quiet, elegant restaurant overlooking the city skyline. The conversation began light, revolving around work and the future of the projects. But as the night wore on, it became more personal. Evelyn shared stories of her past, the struggles that had shaped her, the losses she had endured. Richard listened, captivated, seeing her in a light he never had before. She was resilient, passionate, and fiercely independent. A woman who had not only survived but thrived in a world that had often tried to silence her. "I admire you, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "more than I've ever admired anyone." Evelyn looked at him, her gaze steady, yet he saw the hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "Richard, this journey, it hasn't been easy for either of us. But I've seen you change. You've become someone I can respect, someone I can trust." The unspoken words lingered between them, charged with a tension they could no longer deny. As the evening drew to a close, they found themselves standing on the balcony, the city lights flickering below them. Richard reached for her hand, his fingers gently intertwining with hers, and when she didn't pull away, he knew she felt it too. "I don't just want to lead with you, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I want more." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes shining, and for the first time he saw the walls she had carefully built around her heart begin to crack. "I've waited a long time to hear those words," she admitted, her voice soft. Richard leaned in, his breath warm against her cheek as he spoke, his words laced with a sincerity he had never felt before. "Then let me prove it to you. Not just tonight, but every day." Their lips met, and the kiss was soft, tentative, a promise of what was to come. When they pulled apart, Evelyn rested her head against his chest, a rare vulnerability showing in her posture. For the first time, they weren't just business partners or rivals. They were two people bound by something far deeper. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Richard felt a peace he had never known. He understood now that true power lay not in controlling others, but in surrendering to the things that mattered most. With Evelyn by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead, for he was no longer the man who sought success at all costs. He was a man who had finally learned the value of love, respect, and purpose. And as they looked out over the city together, Richard knew that they were just beginning a journey that would forever change them both. One built on trust, devotion, and the quiet strength of two people who had found their way to each other in the most unexpected of ways.